So I think we should get started. We have a full set of guests here and an audience that has joined us and will perhaps continue to join the numbers. Welcome to our special online event this evening, hosted by the Runnymede Trust, to discuss the 20+1 year anniversary of the Commission on the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain. This commission was set up in January of 1998 by the Runnymede Trust and reported in the year 2000 amidst a great deal of excitement about the report, but also a bitter media controversy at the time. And it's remained over the years a key reference point in debates on anti-racism, on diversity, and on questions of national identity. And here to evaluate its content and the legacy of this report, we have an outstanding panel. This event's been a long time putting together. Yeah, we're just checking to see whether our attendees can hear us. We need a signal from somebody, please. Yeah, thank you. And it's been a long time in the organising. It's we wanted to do a face-to-face event, and it got delayed. 1 year on, we've gone online. And I have to be very brief with the introductions. These are inadequate in the context, but we want to maximise our time today. So we will be hearing first from the chair of the commission, the lead author of the report, whose name became attached to the report in the public eye, the Parekh Report, from Lord Professor Bhikhu Parekh, who of course is a distinguished political theorist, career at the University of Hull, largely, also a former Deputy Director of the Commission for Racial Equality. He will lead us off with an introduction to the report and its legacy. We'll then be joined by another member of the House of Lords, Lord Simon Woolley, who is a leading equalities activist and a former chair of the Government Race Disparity Unit Advisory Group and currently serving as principal of Homerton College in Cambridge. We'll then bring in the current Chief Executive and Director of the Runnymede Trust, Halima Begum, for her comments. She was also involved in the making of the report, which she might like to tell us about a bit as well, all those years ago. And the Runnymede Trust, of course, UK's leading race equality think tank, and really at the centre of these debates all these years. And then I'll be turning to the two co-instigators of this particular project, both of whom are distinguished specialists of political theory and public policy of multiculturalism. Firstly, from Dr. Varun Oberoi, who is a reader at the University of Bristol in political theory and public policy, and then Professor Tariq Modood of the University of Bristol, who's Professor of Sociology, Politics and Public Policy there. And I'm asking about up to 15 minutes from Bhikhu and 10 minutes from our speakers. I'm Adrian Favell. I work at the University of Leeds, the professor there, and currently engaged in a big project on the future of multi-ethnic Britain in the north after Brexit, which Bhikhu has also been involved in as a project. My job here is to really keep things moving, keep track of written questions and answers, which you can start adding as soon as you like during the talks, and I'll also be proactive if I feel there's questions that need asking. So with that, I'll turn over to Bhikhu, and great to see everybody here this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Adrian, for that wonderful introduction to the history of the report. The Commission on the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain, as Edwin said, was set up in January 1998 and reported in July 2000. It can claim many firsts. It is the first commission in the field of race chaired by a non-white academic. Secondly, it has the commission was run by a body of very eminent people in British public and academic life. People including Stuart Hall, one of the finest thinkers in the field of race, Bob Heppel, the Master of Clare College, Cambridge, Lord Ouseley, Trevor Phillips, Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, Sir Peter Newsom, and even Andrew Marr. I mean, these were the people who really put their heads together and thought very hard about issues involving race. It had also a sizable body, one of the first bodies, a sizable body of ethnic minority members. It had not only many internal discussions within it, but also in various public forums where it invited local residents, local citizens, and conducted a dialogue between them and among itself. The report, as Adrian said, was criticized at the beginning, as all good things tend to be, but eventually, of course, many of his recommendations permeated the British consciousness, the British discourse on national identity, and increasingly, I think about 65 to 70% of his recommendations can claim to have been validated and accepted in the country. Now, what I thought I would do, looking back at the report 20 years down the line, is to ask three questions. What was the report trying to do? It had a predecessor in Color and Citizenship, a report put together by Jim Rose and others. And it had successors in other reports like Macpherson and others that came, not Macpherson, but other reports that came after it. Where does it locate itself and what were its central problematic? That's question number one. Secondly, what did it try to achieve? What was its vision of Britain? And thirdly, insofar as that vision was concerned, what are the principles it used to identify issues of racism and racial discrimination? I think the report's basic concern was how to create a society based on shared identity or a common sense of belonging on the one hand, and acceptance of and even love of diversity on the other. Diversity and shared identity, difference and common belonging are both important values, and you can't deal with either alone. Diversity is a fact of life, and it cannot be eliminated without an unacceptable degree of coercion. It increases one's range of choices. It gives one a platform from which to look at oneself and be self-critical. And it also gives one access to the values of other cultures and learn from them and expand and enrich oneself. In the same way, identity, shared identity or common belonging is important because it creates a sense of unity, a sense of mutual trust and self-confidence, common understanding, and therefore makes it easier to live with differences. It is only those who feel a common sense of belonging that they are able to tolerate diversity and not be frightened about it. Diversity without shared identity is fractious, ghettoizes people. Unity without diversity is stifling, dull, and highly coercive. So what you need is a blend of both. And that is what the report intended to do. Our task, therefore, when we met, was to analyze British society, to look at the forces that were promoting or hindering unity and diversity, show how to counter one and discourage the other, and to provide an overall guiding vision. I do not have the time to discuss all this that would mean summarizing the report. So I'll concentrate on three, on report's creative contribution, where I think it breaks new ground and makes a deeply thoughtful and creative contribution to the discourse on race. And there are three areas where I think his contribution is significant. First, it questioned the language in which the debate on race was conducted. Language is very important because it conditions our thinking. And if you speak in a certain way, you think in a certain way. And if you think in a certain way, you act in a certain way. Therefore, the way you act is ultimately shaped by the way you talk and think. And the language of race, therefore, is very important. What we did in the report was to question much of this language. For example, integration. We questioned it because it's a one-way process, where it's the outsider who integrates into our society. No corresponding obligation on us. Or the language of majority and minority. It implies that there are fixed and homogeneous groups. Multicultural is another term that we tend to be critical of, because we are not concerned with culture in a informal sense, but rather culture is embedded in the life and history of a particular ethnic community. And therefore, as the title of the report itself indicates, we talk about the future of multi-ethnic Britain. We could have talked about multicultural Britain, or multi-this or that, or multi-religious. We talk instead about multi-ethnic, because it is culture that is ethnically oriented, ethnically embedded, and derives this vitality from the history and experiences of an ethnic community. We also question the word nation, because nation implies a common culture, a single common culture. And we say that we describe Britain, and here I must pay enormous respect to my very dear friend Stuart Hall, whom I sadly miss. He was the one who said Britain, or most European states, can only be post-nation state, not nation state, but a post-nation state. And the question is, how can you create a state which has a common sense of belonging, but not a common sense of culture, homogeneous culture, as a nation state would require? Similarly, we question the idea of citizenship as something unmediated. Individuals, of course, are citizens, but they are also members of particular communities. And therefore, the state is not simply an association of individuals. It is also the phrase that we liked. We didn't invent it. It is also a community of communities. The phrase for which we were taken to task, for the phrase of whose significance I'm increasingly convinced. It's a phrase that was used by Martin Buber, by lots of other people, on whom Warren Buber has some interesting work. And it was also used by the Institute of Jewish Policy Research a few years ago in describing the Jewish community in Britain as a community of communities. So the state has to be seen as made up of individuals at one level, as liberals would want us to do, but also of communities, in the case of Britain, Scotland, England, Wales, Protestant, Catholics, the rich, the poor, suburbs, inner cities. There are various communities of which this major community is composed. So that's one thing which the report did, question the language. The other thing it did, which I think is even just as important, is to put some new issues on the public agenda. Issues which have been either hinted at from time to time, or glanced periodically, but never properly formulated and pursued. For example, let me just mention 2 or 3 of these issues which have become prominent since, but were not prominent until then. The idea of being British, or British identity. It wasn't one that was debated before. It became quite important for the report, and the report put it on the agenda. What does it mean to be British? It's not the same as Englishness. It is not sufficient, for example, to cover the Irish in Northern Ireland. How should we understand being British so that we come to share a common sense of identity without losing our sense of diversity? That's an important question. How can Britishness be inclusive? At a slightly different level, how is this Britain that we talk about come to be? What is its history? What are the various changes it has undergone? at a slightly different stage? Are there certain values which hold it together and to which most British people will subscribe? What are its rituals? What are the ceremonies? And here the notion of citizenship becomes quite important. And what we do, therefore, in setting up these big issues on the public agenda is, if I may use it philosophical language, produce a blend of liberalism on the one hand and pluralism on the other. And the report, therefore, combines both the liberal and pluralist insights. And the third issue, I'm aware of the time passing, the third issue where we made an important contribution was to understand the nature of racism. It's a word that is very frequently used. It's almost a kind of mice of which one rather never be accused of. What does racism mean? And what if you deny races? Can you still be a racist? How does it perpetuate itself? And how can it be eliminated? And here I think the report does several things. It shows, for example, that racism is understood in at least two senses. One where it means divides mankind into ghettoized, biologically based, distinguishable groups. In the other sense, it means any kind of groups, biologically based or any other, but groups which are internally homogeneous and organized hierarchically. So some groups are always superior to the others, others are always inferior. In either case, it is possible to be a racist without believing in race. Because you can say these groups, the whites, the color-based, or men, are inherently superior to certain groups of people. The British are always superior to the Indians, or the natives, or the original people, or whatever. So in that sense, it is possible to be a racist without believing in race, just as it is possible to believe in race without being a racist, because I could believe that there are different races, but without then going on to say each race must limit itself to its own people, or it mustn't mix with others. Also, I think very significantly, and this is not often noticed, that the report goes on, as it says, goes on to expand and critically analyze Macpherson's idea of institutional racism. And there are 3.5 pages in the report on Macpherson and the idea of institutional racism. And what I think the report does about that idea of institutional racism is, while accepting it, also questioning it and suggesting 2 or 3 important lines of new development. It shows, for example, that institutional racism implies that there is a racism inherent in institutions. But we are talking about, and therefore you are looking for institutions, and you ask, is this institution racist? But institutionalized racism doesn't require institutions. It is a situation where in the procedures, organizations, symbols of an institution, you have a certain way of looking at people. So institutionalized racism is not confined to institutions, is much broader. Second thing that it does is to say, it explores, if you look at Macpherson, he doesn't explore how cultural racism or institutional racism is itself generated. Macpherson talks about unwitting racism, stereotyping people, certain assumptions one makes, certain procedures one adopts, through that racism is perpetuated. But how did that come to be? How did a particular organization come to be structured in a certain way, certain set of policies? And there one has to look at the history of the power relationship. You have to look at colonial history of Britain. You have to look at slavery. In other words, the wider political dimension, as a precipitate of which you have this institutionalized racism, is completely ignored. And I think it's very important that it should be brought to the center of attention. And the third thing that the report does is to indicate that institutional or institutionalized racism is not a homogeneous single entity. It can take different forms, depending on whether it concentrates on individual beliefs or rituals or ceremonies or whatever. In different cases, We have different forms of institutionalized racism and therefore requires different responses. So I think the report, I hope I have given some idea of why at least I was happy to be the chair of it, why I think a lot of us give a lot of time, and why these highly intelligent 23 people put their heads together and produce the report. Now, obviously, when you have 23 brilliant minds put their heads together, they sometimes say things which might be beyond the reach of the marketplace, ordinary people. And this is what happened here when we talk about a post-nation state, or we talk about community of communities. People get frightened. I remember in the Daily Telegraph and other places, people would jump on me, saying, you want to take away from me the idea of Britain being a nation. Or you want us to be a post-nation, which means the nation will go and then will be a khichdi, will be a hodgepodge of things. Is that what you want? So I think there was some degree of deliberate misunderstanding. In other cases, it was simply ignorance. As a result of all of this, some important insights of the report were missed. But I think at the end of the day, goodwill will prevail. And as an event like this one, if 21 years down the line, if we are prepared to spend 2 hours talking about a report, I'm pleased to be associated with it. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Bhikhu, for that very clear, systematized introduction to the report, and I think clearly indicating all the various lines in which the report became so important today. So with that, we'll turn over to Simon for his commentary, which will lead us into further discussion. Do anybody that's out there, you'd like to start posting questions, please do, and I'll be keeping track of those. Simon.
Thank you, Adrian. And first, can I pay tribute to my hero, Dr. Parekh. You know, it's funny when we look back 20 odd years ago, because of course, 25 years ago, we launched Operation Black Vote. And there were exciting, tumultuous times of change. And they demanded a new kind of leadership that emerged from another generation. And for me to come back some 20 years later and to be on a panel with my brother, and I guess fast forward now, my sister Halima and my dear friend Tariq Modood, it brings back wonderful memories. And it also reminds me that it didn't start with us, there are others before us. And there's a golden thread that binds us together in this struggle for equality. That of course, that there were key moments in this struggle, which has always ebbed and flowed, by the way. Back in the 90s, first of all, you have to remember back in the 90s when a prominent cabinet member, Norman Tebbit, characterized our state of belonging by using what he called the cricket test. Remember that? Do you remember that, Bhikhu, the cricket test? Whoever we supported showed our allegiance on whether we could call ourselves Brits or not. The cricket test. We loved our nation's cricket, Barbados, the West Indies, India. And he said, well, if we supported the West Indies, if we supported India, Pakistan, we were not loyal. We were not British citizens. The cricket test. And we challenged that, and we still had this sense of unbelonging when the death of Stephen Lawrence occurred, and that it is also a monumental moment in our history. Operation Black Vote was born in 1996, in which we demanded equality, we demanded justice. Dr. Parekh, they were the intellectuals, by the way. We were the activists. But we admired each other because we knew that we both had a part to play. We said we need to use the vote for justice. They used the intellect and their insight to articulate it on a level that would be respected. But we were bound together. And as activists, we demanded that we have a public inquiry to the death of Stephen Lawrence. And Labour delivered that. If they said, if black people vote for Labour, we'll give you a public inquiry. And it was the public inquiry that laid bare another monumental change in British society. And that change was, actually, it was a white man, a good white man, Macpherson, who Herman Ousley and others convinced him to listen to black people, listen to lived experience that says there was structural racial inequality, not just in the police, but in every facet of society. Now, we knew that for sure. We'd lived it, we'd experienced it. But it wasn't until a white man laid it bare that we could acknowledge that what we were living with. And thereafter, Dr. Parekh was saying, look, we need to understand the complexities of all of this. We need to understand the nuances of all of this. These were exciting times that we were living in, that black people were listened to for the first time for decades. We were making change, we were making progress. And you know, if you fast forward all the changes that had occurred, the change in legislation, more black and brown faces in Westminster, in high places. And then in the last few years, as all our struggles occur, they go forward and they go backwards. And so if we fast forward to the last couple of years, we had another crossroads, another seismic conversation, elements. One, COVID-19, that laid bare the structural inequalities that Dr. Parekh laid bare with his report in education, in housing, in health. Structural inequalities laid bare by COVID-19. And then the death of George Floyd, which really convulsed the tectonic political plates. And at that moment, when we've got my super sister, Halima, who will fill in some of the gaps. But what it meant was that our society was at the crossroads, because never before had such inequality has been laid bare and exacerbated. It remained but one question: what would we do with these facts, these heartbreak inequalities laid bare? Would we acknowledge them and not just build back better? Because build back wasn't great. Would we build new better based upon the dream that Dr. Parekh had back in 20 years ago? And in some quarters, our response was wonderful. Dr. Parekh, in my lifetime, we had some conversations, particularly in business, but also in education institutions and in society. The deepest, most profound, uncomfortable conversations ever. Those conversations from those Black Lives Matter protested argued the institutions that we'd built, the institutions that you'd laid bare back in 20 years ago that were structurally unequal, were built to lock us out, were built to lock the privileged in. And they said, we are not asking, we are demanding. You acknowledge it and you put it right. Deep conversations. And so in one parallel, you had big business laying bare their soul and saying, now we're going to change. And then on another parallel track, to my horror, you had certain sections of government saying, what are you talking about? You've never had it so good. Stop complaining. We've even got a good story to tell about the enslavement of Africans. In short, it was the most shocking denial of people's lived experiences ever. Worse still, the authors were Black and brown, who were handpicked to deliver the most shocking race report ever written in British history. Thankfully, we had wonderful people like Halima and others who came to the front line to say, not on our watch. We've had Dr. Parekh who laid the foundation. We are not going to lose ground on denying people's lived experiences, the shocking inequalities that have been laid bare by COVID-19 and the death of George Floyd. We will push back hard. I'm proud, very proud, to be on a panel tonight with you, Dr. Parekh, who set the foundation, and with Alima, who held that line. Past, present, look into the future. When we confront these systemic inequalities and unleash Black talent, everybody benefits. We learn from what you wrote then. We learn from the battles, the scars that we've all undertook over the past couple of years, rejecting the denial of systemic racism and build a future for our children. I love these sessions, Dr. Parekh, because those on board can listen and learn, but we also build, not back better, build new better. And I hope to be part of that conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. And we'll move straight on to Halima with Simon's invitation.
Thank you. Where do I go with that? I feel as though I'm standing really in the shadows of some amazing leaders who've kind of started the work on racial justice so much earlier. And these are not words, by the way. So as I think Adrian suggested, I was a young professional 21 years ago, working in the Runnymede in a little office downstairs, doing the kind of background papers to support and facilitate the work of Professor Parekh and some amazing leaders. I also remember Operation Black Vote set up by a very young Simon Woolley. So these are not words. And what I now reflect back on is how important that groundwork was, because you laid the foundation for a common terminology on racial justice, how to think about a movement and a struggle, how to use data, without which many organizations that are working on the kind of front line for racial justice, Black Lives Matter, Ubele Initiative, Race on the Agenda, Runnymede Trust, none of these organizations would be here today without that work and that foundation that you laid out. And some of that foundation was laid out by, Stuart Hall. I remember being 22 and being in the presence of that conversation, not really knowing the power of those conversations back then, by the way. I didn't realize that this was history in the making. What you did was history in the making. And I suppose the test of what you did before and what this report created wasn't just a report, by the way. It was shifting popular understanding around Britishness, around how we look at Britain's diverse communities and raise their stakes really in a way that they haven't been able to do individually. So I think it's much more than a report. It's much more about influencing policy and public perception. And that is what I think that report achieved. I remember that conversation around Britishness and inclusive Britishness is what was really, really important back then. And I think we achieved that, because today, when anybody questions our Britishness as minorities, I think we're able to say, I'm both British and Black, I'm British and Pakistani, I'm British and Bangladeshi. So I think that was a challenge then, I think, as you said, Simon, the Tebbit test, right? I mean, the Tebbit test is feeling quite traumatic today, of all days, because we've all been listening to Azim's testimony in the House of Parliament. So there's something about cricket that is particularly raw this week. But I think we have moved on from that. We have moved on from a sense that being British and Bangladeshi or British and Black was somehow different, and that the loyalty test was being applied there. But nevertheless, I think there is something where that journey that we were part of stands at risk of coming apart, really. And I think Bhiku's last point was around the report articulating a public consciousness or understanding of institutional racism. That was a very British take, by the way, on what institutional racism was. It wasn't something that we exported from America. It wasn't something that we exported from Europe. This was out of the experience of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And then we looked at what institutional racism meant in a British context. And I suppose this is what I expected the jumping off point to be with the independent report on race, which Dr. Sewell led, because once you start that conversation around institutional racism, you would expect one of two things: either that was dealt with, in which case we can move on, or you have a more concerted conversation around what institutional racism means and why is most of Britain talking about it and how can we deal with it. And I suppose this is the kind of path roads that we find ourselves in. We've accepted that you can be Black and British. We've also accepted, I think, that there is a different degree of adversity and disadvantage and advantage linked to different minority groups. It is something to be celebrated that we have, people of colour at very senior levels of government today. Absolutely something to be celebrated. And that's great. But similarly, in the same way that we've seen in America with Barack Obama at the helm, there are still issues around racial justice, which actually the rest of the population is concerned with. So until you level up for everybody else, not just those leaders, I think there's always going to be issues to contend with. And I suppose the statistics around minority disadvantage still stands. One of the reasons why Runnymede Trust was set up in 1968, by the way, and I wanted to flag that, was because we wanted to nail the lie on racism. Now, what do I mean by that? It's very easy, by the way, to dismiss racism as somehow someone's perception, someone's experience. So it's not really backed up by the data, is it? So Runnymede Trust was set up to focus specifically on evidence, fact, and insight in order to give more energy and power to the arguments that racial justice existed. And so it's really interesting to find ourselves in a situation where in 2021, we don't rely on facts and evidence. Instead, we go off on theories. But actually, if you look at the bare reality of people's experiences, there are some improvements, but actually nowhere near to the level that white Britons would expect. And that is why it's important to look at the data and the evidence on racism, both at an individual level and at an institutional level. I think most of us can agree that individual acts of racism might be decreasing. But of course, that's not the only form of racism. If you look at the UN definition of racism, it takes all shapes and forms. And to dismiss institutional racism basically means we're missing a historic opportunity to make improvements for the vast majority of ethnic minority people in this country. So I look forward to a more kind of detailed conversation with the audience and the panel. And just to sort of say again, the amazing work that Parekh Report laid out is something that we've been able to work through and pick up. Thank you.
Thank you, Halima. Great, so we can now move on immediately to Varun's contribution. Hey there.
Hi all, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about, I guess, what I think of as one of the most enduring themes of the Parekh Report, and that's reimagining the British story. Now, this is a complex idea, and I think at its most simple, we might think of it in the following way. If British people think of themselves as a racially, religiously, and culturally diverse group who values and welcomes their differences, they're less likely to think of minorities as outsiders. They're more likely to frown on discrimination and exclusion. And in some ways, that was an idea that initially was met with problems in the media, but actually it stood that test quite well. And it survived 9/11, survived the introduction of a community cohesion policy agenda and a prevent agenda, and made its way, I think, I can see in the English national curriculum, I can see it in Life in the United Kingdom booklets. I think that idea became quite mainstream in some ways. But it was competing simultaneously with another agenda that seemed to sort of cancel it out. Just as prospective citizens, immigrants seeking citizenship were learning about Britain's inclusivity and its tolerance, they were experiencing a hostile environment towards immigrants. Just as Muslim children were learning and through the national curriculum about how inclusive Britain was, the areas in which they lived were targeted as prevent priority areas. One arm of government seemed to not know what the other arm of government was doing. And we might say, well, there's nothing new there. And what can policymakers really do to reimagine the British story? Well, actually, policymakers can do quite a lot and have some moderate success at least. Think for a minute about a parallel case. There's some reasonably good evidence that in the 1950s and 60s in Canada, many Canadians, if not most, saw themselves as a British outpost or as a bilingual and bicultural country. This excluded those who were not of British or French descent, and they objected. The Canadian policy of multiculturalism, introduced in 1971, promoted for 50 years an inclusive idea of Canada. And this inclusive idea of Canada jockeyed with prevailing ideas of Canada, jockeyed with various other ways of thinking about who Canadians are, and gradually seemed to make sense of prevailing demographic, political, and sociological changes. Today, there's lots of good survey evidence that shows that Canadians have largely accepted this inclusive understanding of who they are. It's widely held as an idea. Now, widely held doesn't mean universally held. About 30% or so seem to oppose it. Nor does it necessarily mean deeply held. Many Canadians still have some very problematic views about Muslims, for example. But policymakers can, over time, have some influence on how people think of themselves. Should this happen in Britain in a more consistent and coherent fashion than, as I showed, it did? I think so, for at least two or three ideas, for at least two or three reasons. First, the British state unavoidably conveys some sort of understanding of what Britain is. Its dominant language is English. It celebrates certain historical episodes. It gives bank holidays at Christmas and other Christian festivals. It conveys an understanding of Britain still that's quite majoritarian. And yet at the same time, the British state must accord equal status to each British citizen. Otherwise, it's very difficult to defend why each citizen should be subject to the same laws, should have the same rights, should have the same obligations. If it wants to accord equal status to all British citizens, minorities have to be weaved into the idea of Britain that it's projecting. Likewise, if it wants to give equal status to all minorities, then it must combat behavior that attempts to deny that equal status, discrimination, exclusion. Exclusive ideas of the country that we saw, for example, around Brexit, help to cultivate discrimination and exclusion. Again, this can be combated through minorities being included in the British story. So I think there are a number of good reasons for this project to continue today. But I also think that it needs to be adapted ever so slightly. First, reimagining the British story implies there's one story. But actually there are many. There are many ways of thinking about Britain, and perhaps the trick is to include minorities and valuing their differences in all such understandings of Britain. Likewise, Britain is made up of smaller nations. And we probably have to accept that some parts of Britain, such as in Scotland, will always be somewhat hesitant about ideas of Britain. Likewise, reimagining the British story is in part about reimagining the English story. And there is some good evidence now that that's happening, but also some good evidence that minorities are still reluctant, hesitant to see themselves and call themselves English. And there may well be good reasons for that. There's also perhaps a need to think about others who feel excluded from Britain. We often talk about fragile majorities today. A number of white non-graduates feel excluded from the country, and it's these people who often exhibit a level of hostility and discrimination towards minorities. Reimagining the British story is about including minorities and majorities alike in some sort of understanding of the country, including minority nations in the country too. And if national curricula that's now increasingly become narrow were broadened out to promote such an inclusive idea of Britain that included minority nations, included and welcomed minority, religious, racial and cultural minorities too, but also certain other groups, majority groups that also feel threatened, I feel that an understanding of Britain would be articulated that could resonate with minorities and majorities alike. And that, I think, is the sort of reimagining of the British story that Bhikhu and Tariq in some ways had in mind at the time, but it was articulated in a certain form to resonate for a particular audience at that time. But today, if we were to re-articulate that message, I think we would include some of these other groups in it as well. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Varun. And we can move then to our final contribution from Tariq Modood, who, of course, was a very influential member of the Commission. And he will be able to round up the comments and set us on the way to the Q&A. And questions are coming in. Do also indicate if you have a particular speaker in mind for your question. Tariq, thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. So, like Varun, I'd like to pick up a central theme from the Commission's report, something that Bhikhu's already referred to, and relate it to today. I've got a small set of slides, so I'll share those now. Yeah, it's disappeared somewhere. Maybe I'll have to do it without sharing. It seemed to work very well before, but it's not being very cooperative at the moment. So I'll just see if I can. No, I'll have to. There were only a couple of slides. I'll do without them then. So the title of my talk is Enhancing Equality from Anti-Racism to Multiculturalism. So one of the achievements of the Commission's report, and I think Bhikhu referred to that in his presentation, was how it included and built on the anti-racism of that time. I think it included and built it within a multiculturalist framework, which I think was the principal framework of the report. And now today, when we have a reinvigorated anti-racism, that's already been referred to and of course is apparent to us all, the question arises, how does today's anti-racism relate to the way that the Parekh Report related anti-racism and multiculturalism? In the 1980s, multiculturalism was critiqued by anti-racists as being superficial and not focused on deep, challenging issues like structural racism. The anti-racist perception that society has to be understood in terms of black and white, what I call racial dualism, however, looked hopeless once Muslim political assertiveness, most dramatically in the form of the Satanic Verses affair, emerged. After 9/11 and the London bombings of 7/7, the consensus became that multiculturalism was dead. On the other hand, the Black Lives Matter movement has suddenly made anti-racism very live again, and its force can be seen in sport, the media, adverts, politics, the universities, and much elsewhere. So how might we understand the relationship between anti-racism and multiculturalism? So I'd like to say that anti-racism has at least 3 dimensions. Firstly, anti-racism as anti-discrimination. That is to say, everybody should have the same rights and opportunities, and there should be no color discrimination. You know, it's a fundamental idea to anti-racism and to most ideas of equality. The second dimension I'll call anti-racism as de-othering. And Bhikhu Parekh referred to that in his talk when he said, of course, racism isn't just about biology. It can be made to stick, racialization can be made to stick on a variety of kind of groups who are homogenized and placed within a hierarchy. They are othered. So this anti-racism as de-othering, is the critique of stereotypes and demeaning images, such as that Black people are less intelligent or Muslims are fanatics. The third dimension of anti-racism is anti-racism as positive identity affirmation. What I mean by that is based on an understanding that minorities have a right to resist negative images of themselves, but additionally, they can demand that their identities be respected. They have a right to struggle for a positive identity. There are a number of different ways in which a minority can struggle for a positive identity and against the negative identity that dominant groups impose on it. Firstly, is turning a negative identity into a positive racial identity. The best known example of this is how in the 1960s, African Americans took the negative racist label Black and said, white people may think that it's about less intelligence and something to be ashamed of, but we will embrace this term. We will be Black and proud, for Black is beautiful. This was a very powerful movement and was practiced in Britain too. Some Asians joined in and tried to create an anti-racist political blackness. But in time, most Asians responded in 2 other ways, which are respectively the second and third ways of positive identity affirmation as anti-racism. And so the second way is refusing a racialized identity for an ethnic identity. British Asians asserted their own identity regardless of how they were perceived by racists and or anti-racists. Many focused on their national origins, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Indian, and some on their shared South Asian heritage and adopted the term Asian. The third form of positive identity affirmation then is refusing a racialized identity for a religious identity. Because the significance that religious identity has for Asians soon came to the fore. Firstly, with Sikhs and their successful campaign to have the banning of the turban from schools and workplaces declared unlawful discrimination. But the best example of struggle for religious identity affirmation against racism is the case of British Muslims, who began to make this identity a central feature of their multicultural Britishness. The different developments I've highlighted have showed that anti-racism had to acknowledge the diversity of minorities and that there were multiple racisms to be identified and opposed, not just color racism, but also cultural racism, and indeed Islamophobia. This multiculturalizing of anti-racism was a genuine enhancement of equality. The multiculturalism of the 1990s and later built on, of the 1990s and later, built on the anti-racism of the 1980s. This was best exemplified, I think, in the report that we're talking about. The report insisted that difference and equality, respect for minority diversity, and anti-racism had to go together. It offered a long list of institutional reforms that needed to be made to eradicate racism and properly accommodate ethnic, racial, and religious minorities into British society. It recognized that this conception of equal citizenship required a lessening of socioeconomic inequalities, which disproportionately affect minorities. But above all, that the project of racial equality meant rethinking what it means to be British. That is to say, not just white or Christian or secular, and of remaking a British identity for our times. This could not be done without revisiting the history that brought us together: slavery and the British Empire. This has come to the fore again with the Black Lives Matter inspired activism. It has forcefully raised the issue of studying the long process that has made us British and acknowledging and confronting the racism in that racializing and imperial process. A dramatic flashpoint was the toppling of the statue of the slave-owning philanthropist, Edward Colston, in Bristol last year. We similarly need to open up the hidden histories of Muslims and Islam in Britain and Europe, including the more than 750 years in Spain and of the Ottoman Empire in Eastern Europe. Also important is the public recognition of the enormous contribution that all Indian troops made to the British war effort in the 2 world wars, which actually did get some recognition, together with, of course, that from other parts of the former British Empire and the British Commonwealth yesterday. Beyond this common ground, I'm dismayed that some people want to take us back to a black-white dualism, rather than recognizing that multiple identities, including ethnic and religious identities, and multiple racisms, including anti-Asian racism and Islamophobia, have to be the basis not just of multiculturalism, but also of anti-racism. Finally, this appreciation that positive identities matter to people, we must also think about majority identities and our national identities and develop what is positive in them, in just the way that Varun's just been speaking of. Typically, minorities want to belong to something bigger than a group. For example, as the Parekh Report argued, a national citizenship. And this means the negotiation, rethinking, or hyphenating of national identities. Thanks.
Thank you, Tariq. So we have a very rich and wide set of contributions here. And we have a number of questions have come in. What I'm going to propose to do, we have about half an hour, I think, to pursue some of these things. I think we can immediately bring in some of these questions, and I'd like to add a couple of my own. And then I'll get different speakers to respond to different things, perhaps, or to choose one or two of the issues to respond to. The first one builds a little on Jonathan James's comment about the key idea of the community of communities. and whether or not this is still an accepted idea in Britain, how it has played out. Bhikhu alluded to this point. I wanted to raise, for me, this particular question perhaps poses the issue of whether the one thing that got lost in the media controversy at the time and subsequent development of ideas in Britain was in fact the diasporic or post-national dimension of the report that I would associate with Stuart Hall's contribution. I think Bhikhu was partly suggesting this, and this perhaps runs against a bit the kind of national identity arguments that we're hearing as well from some of the contributors. And there is another dimension to the report that I think needs to be put on the table, a missing dimension, if you like, and whether or not this is actually a failing of the report, is that the fact that the report perhaps doesn't pick up the vastly different diversity that becomes so important in Britain after 2000, which is the diversity of new global migrations, and especially European migrations to the UK, new kinds of minorities, new kinds of groups with their own positions in British society in terms of race and ethnicity, but not part of the ongoing discussion of the post-colonial groups that tend to be at the focus of our discussion. And one might argue that that particular dimension of British politics became a very, one of the highly contentious and most difficult aspects of where British politics has taken us in the subsequent years. And I think I might question a little bit the somewhat sanguine tone of some of the discussion in terms of where Britain has got to in the last 20 years. We seem to, we might be seen to have gone backwards rather from the Bhikhu Parekh, the original Bhikhu Parekh work and report. And I'd like to, add to those two particular points. The other questions that we've got here, which I think are all key dimensions of current debates on anti-racism and the controversies around some of the issues that we've heard today. Simon Thompson asked the key question about whiteness as a category in analysis. What the report may have said or not have said about whiteness and whiteness as a rallying cry for political activists. This obviously is linked to the rise of various sorts of populist movements. And Varun certainly also posed this question in a certain way in his presentation. I think we'd also all want to hear more about the subsequent rise of the hostile environment and its particular impact on the Windrush scandal and where that fits into the story that's being told. And that was also an issue very much about the defining of citizenship and the relationship of groups who've come to be referred to as immigrants but were rather subjects of a British Empire and perhaps shouldn't be thought of in the sort of immigration framework that sometimes gets used. And I think we'd like to hear more also about issues to do with British Muslims and particularly, as Seema McArdle suggests, the term Islamic terrorist that is still used very widely in the government and media as a mode of discussing certain sorts of issues to do with integration or cultural diversity. I should have mentioned, of course, it's Julia Davidson who posed the question on the hostile environment. That's quite a bit to be going on with. I'd like to turn to Bhikhu. You've been able to unmute, yes, and invite you to maybe comment on one or two of these things. I think we'd be particularly interested in Varun's suggestion about the missing element of whiteness or the white majority in discussions about British identity, and any other points that you want to pick up.
Well,
I just urge everyone to be relatively brief in your interventions and selective in the topics that you take on.
Well, I'm happy to intervene, although I'll be equally happy to listen to all the comments that you people have to make. On the question of whiteness and Britain, or Britishness, in the report itself, I can handle it at two levels. One, what we said in the report and what I would say now. I think in the report we did give the impression of saying that in order to be British, you must be white. And that, of course, we questioned and saying that's not very inclusive definition of Britishness, and because bound to exclude and alienate a lot of people. So in that sense, the report, I think, slightly overstepped the limits. Today, I wouldn't say this. And again, I think if you look at the thrust of the report, not just a casual remark inadvertently made, but look at the thrust of the report. The thrust of the report is Britishness can be of any color. You can be British without being white or black or whatever. It's color independent. And being British is a political concept. It's a way of subscribing to a community of certain kinds of people held together by certain constitutional principles. Not quite constitutional patriotism of Habermas, but constitutional symbolism. Not just patriotism, but being affected by certain symbols, ceremonies, and all that, by which one recognizes one's country. Now, that I would say is a more inclusive definition of Britishness, where you can be of any religion and still be British. You can be of any come from any part of the world and still be British. That's how I would see this. And there, I think the question would be: does Britishness then transcend all this, or is it immanent in all this? In other words, when you talk about Black British, are you saying that one can be British in a black way, or black in a British way, or are you saying something different? And here again, my answer would simply be: a Black Briton is British as much as anyone else, but he brings to it a different dimension of blackness. I think I should stop there. I could go on, but that's the sort of point I would make. And here an example, which I have often given, is Olympics in Australia years ago, when the black and brown British athletes, having won various medals, did the leg of honor, carrying the Union Jack. Now, what were they saying when the black athletes of UK were doing this? They were saying, we are British just as much as you are. And the flag represents us as much as it represents you. And I think that was a turning point in the perception of blacks. And it's also an important point to make about how inclusive Britain can be.
Thank you, Bhikhu. So maybe I could invite Simon and then Halima to pick up on one or two points that we feel important. Both of you highlighted really the persistence of institutional racism in the UK, and aspects that remain huge policy questions that have not been fully addressed. So, Simon.
Thank you. Well, I did see in one of the chapters, I think it was Colin, that talked about the weaponization of critical race theory right now, which I find depressing if you go down that rabbit hole. But I hope that we're big enough to see. I remember when Dr. Parekh's report came out, they wanted the Runnymede Trust to discuss the merits of multiculturalism as an intellectual conversation. And I said at the beginning that I'm an activist and I'm wary about the intellectual rabbit holes that certain people would like to take us down. I think it's a cul-de-sac. And I think that was one of them, because they wanted to muddy the water. And I think right now, in terms of political race theory, they want to take us down a cul-de-sac once again, to say that the idea that you talk about white privilege and or systemic racism is a theory, not fact, leads us into the weeds. And as such, as activists, we cannot address the systemic racism that is evident, very evident, in employment. I know Parekh Bhikhu was very pleased sitting me on the House of Lords, and one of the select committees that I sit upon is the Select Committee for Unemployment. has highlighted the fact that Black people, Black young men, are 42% unemployment levels, which is basically 1 in every 2 is unemployed, with the national average at, I think, about 12%. This is the reality of systemic racial inequality. And so I implore anyone not to get stuck in the divide and rule critical race theory that Black and brown people are being thrust into the political domain to muddy the water. This is a time not to get stuck in the academic weeds, but to see the reality of inequality and have policy solutions to deal with it. One last thing, Adrian. People like myself and Halima, and I know Bhikhu too, spent most of our adult lives wanting to get Black and brown faces in high places, in politics, in academia, in business. But it saddens our heart when those Black and brown faces are weaponized to hold us back.
Thank you, Simon. Let's turn to Halima. I just want to mention that there's quite a lively amount of discussion also emerging in the chat. I'll try and bring a couple more of those questions in. Everyone, I think, can see the Q&As. So, take your pick as well on key points. Halima.
Thank you. I'm going to try and pick up on some of the comments and the questions and try and be very brief. The reason why it's so important to have Black and brown faces in leadership roles is that if you have a select few that might have a particular view of social mobility, you end up believing that that's the only view of social mobility for racialized minorities. And of course, Simon, the whole power base and the argument that you've been building is that we need to build a broader power base so that one particular version of what is social mobility doesn't prevail. And that's why, going back to my 20-year-old self, it's so important to have people like Lord Parekh, people like Lord Woolley in positions of power, because you're holding up the ecosystem to take more diversity of thought within it. I use diversity of thought very purposefully here, because at the moment we don't have a diversity of thought. We actually have maybe diversity of representation, but not more in terms of what social mobility and progress looks like. There was a question around white privilege and whiteness on the whole. Runnymede Trust, back in 2010, when the Equalities Act was being drawn up, we argued for the public sector duty on socioeconomic inequalities to be made law as part of the legislative process, because if it was part of the public sector duty in the Equalities Act 2010, it would mean that a majority of white people in this country who are working class would be leveling up. So we argued for that back in 2010. I think on the one hand, I see a rhetoric around leveling up, but on the other hand, there's sort of reluctance to go through the law process and actually do something in terms of action to support working class people from Black and minority and white groups on the whole. We obviously believe in a multi-ethnic working class. We don't believe that the working class is either white or Black, but that actually some government action on socioeconomic inequalities would be a good thing. And then there was a point around institutional racism. It is really important that that is the jumping off point for this report, isn't it? Because 20 years ago, we talked about institutional racism. 21 years on, post-Sewell report, that is still a conversation. And I think I defer to Simon, who's been around a lot longer than I have, that if we simply went into the weeds to talk about what we should and shouldn't do, having had the evidence and the fact for so long, I think the younger generation will give up on us. I think we need to tell them that we've heard. Some people often say you should speak up against racism. I actually think we should listen up to people who have been talking a lot about racism and that experience. If we listen up, we might actually take some action. So I think what the public wants now, post Black Lives Matter, is more action, because we've had the evidence and the data. And one thing I will finish with is racism is not a theory, is it? It's a fact. And that's why Runnymede Trust was just at pains back in 1968 to look at the evidence and the data around racism to say, this isn't about theory, this isn't about an academic conversation. Most people who experience racism are really not in academic institutions or policy think tanks like I am. They're experiencing that in stop and search. Black women are experiencing racism when they're pregnant. Black children, Black boys are being excluded at a disproportionate rate. That is happening at the school level. So I think we need to be very mindful when others try and kind of position a discussion on racism as theory, which is what critical theory is designed to do at the moment, and not get distracted by that. We are interested in ending racism on the streets, in the workplace, and in universities, and everywhere where it's happening. We're not interested in just an academic discussion.
Right. So I'd like to invite Varun and then Tariq to come back in. I want to add a couple more points that have emerged as well in the discussions. One was from Anna Triandafilidou, who asked, Canada was mentioned in Varun's discussion, but Anna's asking about the potential of European influences on discussions in the UK, parallel experiences, ideas of multicultural citizenship and other things that maybe need to be brought into a perspective on Britain. And can I just finish? And then a second question that an anonymous attendee has posed about whether it's correct to describe Islamophobia as a form of racism in this context. Islamophobia as a form of racism. Something that tends to split certain Muslim positions in relation to issues of recognizing racism in different terms. So so I'd like to get comments on those if possible, and any other issues. Bhikhu, did you want to just quickly say something?
There's just two things. I think there is a danger of dismissing discussion as academic discussion and treating academic discussion as not particularly relevant to the struggle that we are talking about. I think that will be a serious mistake, because it is the academic discussions, in my experience, sitting on this commission, that clarified so many issues and make it clearer for us what the objective of the struggle should be and how it should be conducted and how it shouldn't. Because you could put people like me and many others in parliament, and at the end of the day, nothing might happen. You might be subtly co-opted into the system and end up being the opposite to what we should be doing. So I think I wouldn't simply dismiss academic discussion so easily.
I think, I think we're enjoying very much the mix of academic and activist points of view in our debates today. So Varun, please do come in. We're getting a bit short on time, so
yeah, sure. No,
we'll come back to some final comments in a moment.
Yeah,
I'll try and be brief. And now that Bhikhu has said what he's just said, I feel like I can answer the question about community of communities that came in. How well did that idea fare? Well, look, let's first try and understand what was meant by it. Step one, Britain is a community. It has certain ways of doing things that have merged over time, over history. It has certain norms, certain practices, certain types of behavior that are common. Step two, it also contains individuals. Step three, it also contains communities within that broader community. Step four, the report said we should think of Britain in this way. Because if we think of Britain in this way, we're emphasizing that it's a unit or a group, it has unity, but it's not threatened by its differences. How has that idea fared? I don't know. At one level, I think that Halim's right. Many people do accept hyphenated Britishness. But at another level, the whole point of that idea was that it would be a unity that wasn't threatened by differences. And when you look at fear of immigration today, when you look about debates that have emerged about Brexit, when you look at levels of discrimination and so on, I don't get the sense that Britain is at ease with its differences. I get the sense that many British people are fearful of those differences. And that's really your point, Adrian, when you say there's been a backward step, I think. So partially realized is my answer to the question, and partially not. And perhaps one reason why it hasn't been realized, and this is the point about whiteness, I think more could have been said at the time of the Parekh Report about dominant groups who are feeling left out of these discussions. And today we wouldn't leave them out, and we would recognize how that fuels racism and discrimination. And so whiteness would be part of the conversation today about reimagining who we are. I'll stop there.
Tariq.
Yeah, so I think what's distinctive about the Parekh Report relative to all the other reports that we've had on racism and discrimination and so on, is of course, it's a report that has an intellectual argument, an intellectual vision, in the way that the Macpherson Report or the Scarman Report or other firefighting reports that are built on a particular incident, like the a murder or a riot or something like this. So if you say, well, we don't need intellectual visions, well, I think you are degrading the Parekh Report. And I think we do need intellectual arguments and visions. And I'll illustrate that by answering, not so much answering, but referring to a question that you raised, Adrian. Well, in a way, it was a series of questions that you packed together by saying, did the Parekh Report miss something when it didn't speak about diaspora, when it didn't speak about global migration flows, and when it didn't speak about European freedom of movement? Well, perhaps it did. I mean, the answer to that can't be by looking at factual evidence. We need an intellectual discussion about how we frame our understanding of our society, our country, of the social phenomena that we think are issues that have to be engaged with, and if so, what principles and values do we draw on in engaging with them? So that would require, as it were, another report, Parekh Report Mark II or some successor report. And one of the reasons I say that I don't have the answer to the sets of questions that you're asking, Adrian, is because I suppose I do feel very committed to the intellectual framework of that report. And that intellectual framework is very much a British framework. It's an idea about British history, about British Empire and Commonwealth, about British citizenship, about the changes in British society. So I would try, I'm not saying it would succeed, but I would try to respond to more recent changes about migration and so on by trying to relate them, by trying to integrate them into that framework. Perhaps it can be done, perhaps it can't be done. Perhaps the difference between, people like the people coming from the Commonwealth in the 50s and 60s with their sense of relationship to Britain, perhaps that can't be extended to talking about migration today when we're talking about people who don't have a relationship to Britain, or we call the British story and so on, a relationship positive or negative, So racism, the racisms that we've been talking about, the report talks about, are part of that history, but so is the idea that we can be British together and that we have a historical origin. And I'll just make one more remark, and that is in response to Bobby Said's question that if we were to do the report again today, what is the one thing we would want to include? Well, I would very much want to include the whole set of issues to do with Islamophobia, which I think we did some pioneering work in including. Of course, there had been the Runnymede report on Islamophobia itself, but in terms of integrating it into a report about racial equality and diversity, multicultural diversity, I think we were the first to go beyond color and culture and talk about religion. And we did have a chapter dedicated to that. But I think it was just a first step, and we could have done more. And certainly if we were to do it again today, I would want to make that much more central rather than, 1 out of 15 or 20 chapters.
Thank you, Tariq, for picking up those points. So I hope we might still have a couple of minutes with our speakers just over the 7:30. They'll let me know if when they will have to go. But I just wanted to get everybody to take a look into the chat and the Q&A before you go. And I wonder if we could wrap up a little bit. Any final comments that anybody would like to make? I think the issue of this discussion's contribution to the ongoing cultural wars in the UK is a key one.
I'd like to very much come in on that, if I may, Adrian, and also Bhikhu's point about, is there a tension between activism and academic rigor? No, there isn't. There really absolutely isn't, and we mustn't let that divide us, because we need them both. I think that we're smart enough to understand that there are some out there that would like us to go into an academic cul-de-sac. And I think one of those cul-de-sacs, quite frankly, is the culture wars. The culture wars that is presented today has nothing to do with culture. Culture is used as a stick, but the real debate is, how can we pit poor white people against poor black people? This is not culture wars, these are power wars. Power wars, and culture is used. And if you go down the cul-de-sac of culture wars about the statues and stuff, you end up infinitum discussing the rights and wrongs of every statue and don't get very much further forward. But if you understand that our detractors want to maintain power and will use whatever tool to send us down into the cul-de-sac and the weeds, then they will. They did it with multiculturalism, they'll do it with the cultural wars. We have to be smart enough to know which battles to fight academically and also particularly politically. And there is a raging battle out there at the moment that many black and brown people are weaponized to fight this woke warrior foe culture wars, and we must resist it. If Parekh has taught, if Dr. Parekh has taught us anything, it is unity, not just unity of black and brown, but unity of black, brown, and white.
That's
And
right.
when we come together, with that energy, then we can see a bigger picture of national unity, of national identity, and avoid the bear traps of the pseudo-cultural wars. They would like nothing more than for us to immerse ourselves in whilst our nations are divided and the status quo maintained.
Thank you, Simon, for joining us today. Halima, maybe a last word for the Runnymede Trust.
Yeah, I think probably Simon kind of alluded to what I was going to come back with, which is that right now, so there was no attempt to say that academic conversations are not visionary or not needed, quite the opposite, in fact. But what we think is happening at the moment is that academic freedom and notions around political theory are being used by our detractors to reverse against on anti-racism. And I'll tell you why. At the moment, impartiality is being weaponized against anybody who's an anti-racist. So if you want to teach anti-racism in your schools or your universities, you might be finding that the vice chancellor is feeling the pressure a bit on impartiality, because suddenly he or she or they are being told that actually taking an anti-racism stand within your university campuses is a political viewpoint. Now, the BBC is facing that, so many other institutions are facing that. So that's why we're just being a little bit careful tactically about how we focus our efforts. So that was my kind of warning point. The other point around Islamophobia, I just wanted to come back to a very simple point, because actually Professor Modood wrote about this 20 years ago. But the one thing I will remind everybody is that Azim Rafiq isn't just facing racism. He talked about being a 15-year-old and being called all sorts of names, but also being forced to drink wine as a Muslim. That is an act of Islamophobia. It isn't just an act of racism. But often, of course, racism, Islamophobia, sexism, they all collide, don't they? They don't just exist in isolation. And we just should be mindful that how we support Muslim communities with racism and Islamophobia is as important as anti-Black racism, as we've seen with Black Lives Matter.
So very, very shortly, I'd like to invite Varun and then Tariq and then Bhikhu to make a final statement, if you wish.
I'm happy to give up my time to Bhikhu and Tariq. This really was their report, so I think I shouldn't take up any more airtime. Thank you, but I do want to thank Runnymede for organising and hosting, and thank you, Adrian, for doing such a wonderful job of chairing. That's it.
So two of the members of the commission, what would be your final reflection in the light of our discussions today?
Well, Bhikhu should certainly have the last word, so I'll insert myself in now, and just briefly. Like Varun, I'd like to thank the Runnymede Trust for hosting this event, and to Lord Simon Woolley for participating in and wanting to do so from the word go with enthusiasm and his characteristic vigor. Thank you, Simon. As for my kind of last word, well, so culture wars. I mean, we know that this is a highly kind of politicized, and people talk about weaponized terrain, but in a way, I feel, doesn't there have to be a culture war? When we talk about rethinking what it means to be British, and rethinking the national story, and rethinking slavery and empire as part of the British story, that's a cultural challenge. That's throwing down a gauntlet. And I'll just finish with an anecdote. People will remember, some people certainly remember, including some people sitting here, that when the report was published in October 2000, it was met with a very vicious and severe barrage of angry noise from the right-wing press, some of it general, some of it targeting individuals, members of the commission and so on. And I was very upset by it, thought, oh my God, you know, we've managed to not get the right response. So there's something wrong in what we did. We failed in some kind of way. And I remember at the time, Stuart Hall said, no, this is a sign of success. If we were talking about something unimportant, they wouldn't react like this. So I think in a way, a culture war is part of where we are. Of course, that doesn't mean that the way the government's using it or some right-wing press is using it is a legitimate, reasonable way. No, I agree with some of the remarks made by Simon and Halima. There's all kinds of camouflage and obfuscation. But what we need to do is to fight the right culture war, not by saying, actually, we're not in culture wars. Though war's perhaps a little too violent a metaphor. And we do sometimes talk about challenges and struggles and so on. And that would probably suit me better.
Thank you, Tariq, for that wrap up. And over to Bhikhu for a last word. We do have to close and not stretch the patience of our audience too long, but we need you to unmute. We can't hear you, Bhikhu. Yeah.
Can you
Okay.
hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, first of all, as the chairman of the commission, I want to thank everyone, because all these comments and questions have been very illuminating. And I want to thank people for taking the trouble of reading the report or thinking about the issues that it had raised. So thanks to Simon, Varun, Adrian, Halima, all of you, for the wonderful things that you have said. On one or two larger questions, which I'm tempted to address, I think the first thing is when we talk about anti-racism, I feel slightly uncomfortable. This kind of anti-thing is always uncomfortable. We are not just talking about a negative line, I'm anti-racist. I'm much more than that. What is it much more than that? So that's the first thing I want to emphasize, that there is a way of saying, even with the most racist person I can think of, to be able to discover a common ground and to be able to show to him why he's mistaken, to fight his racism but not him. I think that's quite important. And I would therefore be slightly cautious about the word anti-racism. Not that it's imposed is wrong, but that it is partial, one-sided. And the other thing I think we need to emphasize is what Tariq said toward the end, and I think you, Adrian, referred to it. And Tariq said multiculturalism has to be multi, in the sense that it recognizes different dimensions of identity. Similarly, when you talk about Black Lives Matter or Black movement or whatever, there's a danger of defining Black simply as Black, not to define it in an inclusive way, so as to include the Indians, the Pakistanis, the other groups and other races. So I think it's very important for the Blacks who are, if you like, the vanguard of the struggle, to be able to take the others with them and to arrive at an inclusive definition of Blackness, such that everyone feels that his or her interests are also being promoted.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to stop, maybe. I'd like to thank all of our attendees to this event. There's been a very lively discussion going on in the chat, which we'll be happily copying. And we are hoping to make this event available as a recording through the Runnymede Trust. Thank again the Runnymede Trust and Halima Begum for the opportunity to put together this event and to remember a report that's still very much available, I think, on the Runnymede website. We will continue to discuss this, I'm sure, for many more years. Thanks to everybody. We'll close there and hope to see you all again soon.